John Edwin Bull was born in England in 1836. Other than that, we know virtually nothing of his early life, including when or where he first arrived in the United States. Hell, truth be told, I'm not even sure that's his real name. The term John Bull first originated as a satirical character back in the early 1700s, and for a long time it just sort of described the common man there in the UK. It's not used very much nowadays, but back in the mid-19th century, it would not have been unheard of to hear someone from England referred to as a John Bull. So if that was our topic's name, that'd be quite the coincidence. Nevertheless, it's all we've got, so John Bull it is. Now, Bull first appears on record in 1861 when he joined the gold rush to Elk Creek Basin in present-day Montana. Not as a prospector, though. Oh, no, no, no. You see, John Bull was a gambler, and as such, he learned to extract gold from a poker table rather than a cold crick. And in addition to being a gambler, John was also just a tad bit on the deadly side. Case in point, in August 1862, Bull gunned down a horse thief by the name of William Arnett. John had tracked Arnett and his two accomplices all the way from Elk City, Idaho, to a little mining camp southeast of Missoula. Upon arrival, Bull located the thieves in a tent saloon playing Monty and ordered them to surrender. Be that as it may, I guess Arnett was hard of hearing, and instead of throwing his hands up, he went for his gun, which left John Bull no other choice but to give him a load of buckshot straight to the chest. The next day, a miners' court was convened for Arnett's surviving companions, and one of them, a man described by locals as rather quiet, reserved, and pleasant, was hung by the neck till he was dead, dead, dead. Remember what Gus McCrae said in Lonesome Dove, right? You ride with an outlaw, you die with an outlaw. And, well, as nice and reserved as I'm sure this young man was, I guess he should have picked a better riding companion than William Arnett. As for the third guy, he somehow convinced Bull and the others that he had only recently fell in with the thieves, and thus wasn't responsible for stealing no horses. They let him go with a stern order to leave camp and don't come back, or else. Now, the next few years are a bit of a mystery, but by 1866, John could be found in Virginia City, Nevada, partnered up with fellow gambler Langford Peel. And if John Bull was deadly, then Langford Peel was the damn bubonic plague. He too was an Englishman by birth, poor bastard, and upon arriving in America enlisted in the army at the outrageously young age of 12. Served for a total of 10 years, during which time he saw action as a dragoon, not only in the Mexican-American War, but also in several skirmishes with the Native Americans. Upon mustering out of the service, Peel then became a professional gambler, just plying his trade in various boom towns across the West. And yeah, occasionally he would make a deposit at the local Boot Hill while doing so. Like the time in 1858 when he and a faro dealer named Rucker got into an argument in a Salt Lake City beer joint. One thing led to another, and they both went for their guns and opened up fire at the exact same time. Both men were hit, and they both continued firing until their revolvers were clicking on empty. Peel, himself suffering from a total of 3 gunshot wounds, still managed to drag himself across the floor and sink his knife into Rucker's chest. Then, I guess figuring that he was about to die, he told witnesses that he had a wife in Leavenworth and to let her know that he had fought to the last minute. Only thing was, Peel didn't die. Ended up making a full recovery and went right back to being an itinerant gambler. Story goes that he wound up killing 6 men there in Nevada alone. And like I said, it was in Virginia City where he and our topic du jour, John Bull, first struck up a partnership. It's also where the great Mark Twain may have possibly been the one to give Peel the iconic nickname of Farmer. Per author Robert D. Arment, quote, "They called this tall, dangerous fighting man Farmer for the same reason they called a bald-headed man Curly," end quote. So there you have it, kind of like calling a large man Tiny. And as far as Peel and John Bull and their various associates were concerned, Twain had this to say. They were brave, reckless men and traveled with their lives in their hands. To give them their due, they did their killing principally among themselves, and seldom molested peaceable citizens, for they considered it small credit to add to their trophies so cheap a bauble as the death of a man who was not on the shoot. They killed each other on slight provocation, and hoped and expected to be killed themselves, for they held it almost a shame to die otherwise than with their boots on. End quote. Interestingly enough, our very own John Bull would end up robbing Mark Twain just outside of Virginia City. Kind of. Apparently, the famous author was a bit of a prankster, and at some point he had played some sort of an ill-advised trick on John Bull. And in retaliation, Bull and a few of his buddies waylaid Twain just outside of town, in disguise of course, and held him up at gunpoint. making off with all of his money and a gold watch to boot. A few days later, as Twain was boarding a stagecoach bound for California, his valuables were returned in a grand fashion, every penny, along with that watch and the hoods that the thieves had used to cover their faces. That's when Mark found out that the culprits were John Bull and his compadres, and the robbery was their sick version of a joke. Story goes that Twain, quote, talked to the boys quite profanely until the stage drove off, end quote. And according to Twain himself, this entire ordeal cured him of playing practical jokes going forward. Years later, Henry Hoyt, author of Frontier Doctor, would write that Bull laughingly told us how the young newspaperman could never see any joke in the affair. It was carried out much too realistically for any laughs. And yeah, I bet it was. You know, I too like to mess with people. I love a good practical joke. But I made it a rule a long time ago not to pull pranks on crazy people. You never know how they're going to react, and I damn sure wouldn't try my luck on a homicidal gambler like John Bull. But then again, I'm no Mark Twain, so what do I know? Now, after leaving Virginia City, Bull and Farmer Peel traveled together throughout Utah, but somewhere along the way, their relationship soured and they split up. The cause of this discord is unknown, but they had apparently kissed and made up by the summer of 1867, as they were once again running a crooked game together in Helena, Montana. Not for long, though. They butted heads once more, and this time things got real serious, real fast. Both men were in a saloon, seated, when all of a sudden they jumped to their feet and began shouting at one another. This led Peel to open-hand slap John Bull square in the face with his left hand as he snaked out a six-shooter with his right. In turn, Bull stated that he was unarmed, to which Farmer replied that he best go heal himself. In other words, come heavy, or don't come at all. Later on that evening, as Farmer Peel stepped out of the saloon and began walking down the street arm in arm with his mistress, here comes John Bull emerging from the shadows. Shot Peel twice and then strolled over and nonchalantly delivered a coup de grace to the veteran gambler's head. John was arrested for this killing and ended up going to trial, but it resulted in a hung jury, so he was let loose. Next stop was Cheyenne, which at that time was a very rough, end-of-the-track tent city along the Union Pacific Railroad. And mostly due to the killing of Farmer Peel, John did enjoy somewhat of a celebrity status there among his fellow badmen. To once again quote Mark Twain, the desperado stalked the streets with a swagger, and a nod of recognition from him was sufficient to make a humble admirer happy for the rest of the day. When he moved along the sidewalk in his excessively long-tailed frock coat, shiny stump-toed boots, and with a dainty little slouch hat tipped over left eye, the small fried thoughts made room for his majesty. When he entered the restaurants, the waiters deserted bankers and merchants to overwhelm him with obsequious service. When he shouldered his way to a bar, the shouldered parties wheeled indignantly, recognized him, and apologized. End quote. Now that's from Twain's book Roughing It, a semi-autobiographical travel log of sorts that, in part, discusses his time in Nevada when he had brief run-ins with both John Bull and Farmer Peel. I don't think he's talking specifically about Bull here, but you get the gist, right? John earned himself one hell of a reputation after gunning down Peel, a reputation that ensured others would give him a wide berth. And truth be told, Peel was the last man that the Bull ever killed, at least that we know of. That said, just because he was done killing, allegedly, doesn't mean that the violent escapades were over. Far from it. Bull ended up traveling with the Union Pacific, following the expansion all the way to Utah, where it linked up with the Central Pacific, and it's there in Utah where John met his wife. I'm not entirely sure the particulars, or even her name for that matter, but it soon became evident that John's new bride wasn't about that life. Rather than settle down as a couple, he just stuck her in a Chicago boarding house as he continued to gamble. He did visit on occasion, though, and the two would have 2 children, but sadly, Mrs. Bull passed away a few years into their nuptials. And even more sadly, John Bull then placed his kiddos in a foster home and returned out west. As far as I know, he never had contact with them again. Eventually, John would settle down for a bit in Omaha and work with a gang of con artists and card sharps, led by an old boy known as Canada Bill Jones. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Rounders, which in my opinion is hands down the greatest poker movie of all time, Matt Damon's character actually quotes Canada Bill with the line, "It's immoral to let a sucker keep his money." And by all accounts, this was pretty much a motto that John Bull lived by there in Omaha. Indeed, one of his duties was to lead unsuspecting marks to the various crooked games of chance ran by Canada Bill. And when a certain railroad employee attempted to warn others as to Bull's true intentions, John and one of his companions ended up pulling out knives and cutting the do-gooder up something fierce. Authorities located Bull in a saloon later on that morning, around about 4:30, but the inebriated Englishman apparently was not in the mood to be arrested. Rather than surrender, he jerked out a large Navy Colt and aimed it straight at the marshal, saying that he would not allow himself to be taken until the revolver was empty. As you can imagine, the lawman turned on his heels and headed in the opposite direction. Nevertheless, John's freedom was short-lived. He soon passed out drunk there in the saloon, and per author Robert D. Arment, quote, "When awakened by a friend later, he, John Bull, quietly submitted to arrest," end quote. Now that railroad man that Bull stabbed was in pretty bad shape. And what's more, he had friends. Friends who wasted no time in forming a vigilante committee with the intent of stringing Bull up from the nearest convenient tree. Luckily, however, the wounded man pulled through, so the unsanctioned lynching was called off. And icing on the cake, when John was dragged to court, the victim was not able to make a positive identification, or at least so he claimed. And once again, John Bull was a free man. Now that was in July of 1873. Just a few months later, in mid-November, Bull was involved in a rather controversial boxing match. The bare-knuckled brawl, billed as a contest for the heavyweight champion of the United States, saw pugilist Tom Allen face off against challenger Ben Hogan. Only problem was the fight was deemed illegal as hell. And when the militia came to put an end to the festivities, the promoters simply packed up and moved east across the Missouri River, setting up shop near Pacific Junction, Iowa. The bout commenced as planned on November 18th, but soon devolved into absolute chaos. John Bull, who was acting as the timekeeper, had placed quite a bit of money on Ben Hogan. And during the second round, when it looked like Hogan took a low blow to the groin, Bull jumped into the ring crying foul. Either that, or there was no low blow and he was just trying to fix the fight. Whatever the case, the referee dismissed the call, and the bout continued 30 seconds later. But by that time, Hogan was spent, ended up collapsing to the ground, and the crowd went wild. In an effort to placate both sides and hopefully prevent a riot, the ref then announced that the fight ended in a no contest and that all bets were off. As I'm sure you can guess, this did not have the desired results. Pandemonium ensued as fights broke out amongst the crowd. Not only were several of the spectators injured, but at least one man was even killed. Not long thereafter, the heat got a little bit too much there in Omaha, so John packed up and headed to the new boomtown of Deadwood. What exactly he got up to while he was there, I don't know, but you can be sure it likely had something to do with the partying of fools and their money. Next stop was Denver, where John would end up getting arrested several times over the course of the next few years. From everything from public drunkenness to fighting, disturbing the peace, and even resisting arrest. It's also where he teamed up with fellow gambler John Wilcoxon, aka Jim Moon. The pair would open up a combination restaurant and gambling joint there in Denver called the Oyster Ocean. But as it turns out, old Jim Moon had some anger management issues. One night, as he and John Bull and a pair of ladies were having a party, they caused too much of a ruckus, and it weren't long until the police showed up. And rather than promise to be a good boy and keep the noise to a minimum, Jim Moon instead just waded into the lawmen with his fists swinging. Next thing you know, John Bull joins in the fight, and the police officers make a hasty retreat and call for backup. And when reinforcements arrived, Moon and Bull were ready, just standing resolutely in the doorway with guns in hand. Luckily, though, cooler heads did prevail, and the two gamblers ended up surrendering without making any more of a fuss. Now, just some additional info on this Jim Moon guy. I don't know much about the man, but what little I do know makes me want to learn more. For instance, back in October of 1880, a mob descended upon Denver's Chinatown, and within a matter of hours, they destroyed several businesses and homes and killed at least one of the local Chinese residents. And they may have killed even more had Jim Moon not intervened. Rather than join the mob, Moon instead rushed to defend the Chinese, even to the point of standing guard in front of a laundromat with a pistol in each hand. He's also credited with hiding over a dozen of the Chinese populace in the basement of a nearby gambling establishment, the famous arcade on Larimer Street. And at least one account I found claimed that John Bull was there by his side as all this was going down. Sadly, or I guess maybe I should say predictably, Moon's life would come to an abrupt end just 7 months later. He was in the arcade, just gambling and drinking, when once again his anger got the best of him. Apparently he thought that another gambler, Clay Wilson, was making eyes at his woman, so Moon attacked. And rather than duke it out, Wilson instead drew a revolver and put 2 rounds into Jim's body. The end. Now, like I said earlier, both Moon and Bull were arrested after that big brawl with the police. But once again, all he received was a slap on the wrist. And after being released, John Bull then made his way to the small town of Big Whiskey, Wyoming, where, as it turns out, he almost immediately fell into the bad graces of a local sheriff named Little Bill Daggett. And for good reason. This was right after President McKinley was assassinated, and Bull evidently found his death hilarious and was going around singing the praises of English royalty, on Independence Day no less. In the end, Sheriff Daggett gave Bull quite the beating there on the main thoroughfare of Big Whiskey, and when John was on the ground, the good sheriff even put the boots to him. Eyewitnesses would later recount that as Daggett was kicking John, he loudly proclaimed, "I guess you think I'm kicking you, but it ain't so. What I'm doing is talking. You hear? I'm talking to all those villains down there in Kansas, and I'm talking to all those villains in Missouri, and I'm talking to those villains down in Cheyenne, and I'm telling them there ain't no whore's gold." Sorry, got a little carried away there. And no, that story about the fictional town of Big Whiskey is actually not true. In fact, that was just a part of the plot to one of the greatest Western movies of all time, Unforgiven. That said, it is kind of hard not to think about English Bob from Unforgiven when discussing John Bull, right? I know I can't be the only one. And I did find at least one similarity, other than both of them being limeys. Remember that scene in Unforgiven when English Bob was shooting pheasants from the train? Well, there was a comparable incident involving the real John Bull back in 1878. Only instead of a train, it was a stagecoach, and rather than pheasants, it was prairie dogs. No word on whether John Bull went around badmouthing the president on the 4th of July, though, and I'm relatively certain that nobody ever referred to him as the Duck of Death. Now, in real life, Bull left Denver for good in 1882 and took to riding the rail, just gambling back and forth from Minneapolis all the way west to Seattle. He also made a trip back to the motherland, jolly old England. I don't know how true this is, but legend has it that John and a partner were selling fraudulent stocks and played out silver mines. Apparently, they dined with the Prince of Wales. I assume an abundance of fish and chips and baked beans were consumed. And when it was all said and done, they said, "Cheerio, old chap," and returned stateside with a cool $25,000 profit, which, adjusted for inflation, is damn near $900,000 in today's money. Not a bad payday, to say the least, isn't it? That said, flush with cash or not, the trials and tribulations of John Bull weren't over just yet, and he would end up having a very close call one evening in Spokane, Washington. He and a soon-to-be ex-friend named Fisky Barnett had gotten drunker than Cooter Brown, and by all accounts, they was both having a good old time. At least they were until, for some unknown reason, Barnett all of a sudden took his cigar and extinguished it straight into one of John Bull's eyes. Ugh, hurts just thinking about it. John reacted in a somewhat predictable manner. He yelled out in pain, covered his eye with one hand, and pulled his gun with the other, and just began blindly shooting. Barnett, being the brave soul that he was, took cover behind a nearby woman, and he too pulled a gun and started firing back. When the smoke cleared, all three of them were laying in the street in a pool of blood. Fisky Barnett had lost a finger. That poor lady took one of John Bull's rounds to the lungs, and John Bull himself was shot no less than 4 times. In his arm, his groin, yikes, his neck, and oddly enough, his chin. Believe it or not, both he and the woman would pull through. And for all this trouble, old Fisky Barnett was simply fined $10 and sent on his way. John Bull ended up having his left arm amputated, and that bullet lodged in his neck was too close to the windpipe for the doctor's liking. Ended up carrying it for another 2 decades until finally he found a surgeon in Missouri who was willing to fish it out. Of course, by then, John Bull was an old man and the West was no longer wild. He stuck around, though, until finally, 8 years after that neck surgery, Bull gave up the ghost. The year was 1929, and according to him, he was 93 years old at the time of death. 1929. That's crazy to think about. And you know me, I'm forever fascinated by people like John Bull who not only saw the West in all of its wild glory, but lived long enough to see the frontier give way to so-called civilization. When Bull first arrived in Montana, there was still a very real threat that his scalp would end up on a warrior's lodgepole. He spent years in boom towns where the only law was what a man could enforce with his own fist or knife or gun, brushing shoulders with deadly types that'd just as soon shoot you as look at you. And through it all, John Bull survived. He may not have been a good man, and along the way he may have lost an arm and an eyeball, but unlike many of his contemporaries, he died an old man with his boots off. It's stories like this that always remind me of that old Guy Clark song, The Last Gunfighter Ballad. Now the burn of a bullet is only a scar, and he's back in his chair in front of a bar. And the streets are empty and the blood's all dried. The dead are dust and the whiskey's inside. So buy him a drink and lend him an ear. He's nobody's fool and he's the only one here who remembers the smell of the black powder smoke and the stand in the street at the turn of a joke. Kinda makes me wonder if John Bull, in his old age, ever bellied up to a bar and started telling stories. And if he did his fellow patrons believe what he was saying or just dismiss his words as the ramblings of a confused old man? Now, when it comes to the Old West, it's usually guys like Butch Cassidy and Billy the Kid or Jesse James or even Wild Bill that get the most attention. And to be honest, this is mostly due to Hollywood. They're the ones with the movies made about them, so by default, they become household names. We tend to forget that for every Pat Garrett or Wyatt Earp, there were a dozen John Bulls or Jim Moons or Farmer Pills. Deadly men in their own right who, for whatever reason, just never happened to have any books or movies based on their exploits. Now, if you'd like to learn more, my primary source was Robert K. D.R. Mint's Deadly Dozen Volume 1. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on John Bull. Short episode this week, but as usual, we've got a lot in the works. Before you go, though, I do have a couple of announcements. You may have already noticed, but we do have some new Wild West Extravaganza artwork. Shout out to Mark DeCoates over at podcastbranding.co for helping to class this joint up a little bit. This is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. Other than two of our previous pieces of cover art, I've designed them all myself, and I was never really happy with the outcome. So I finally just bit the bullet and hired a professional. And yeah, this does mean that new merchandise is on the way, especially now that we've got an official logo as well. There was other merchandise available until very recently. Many of you have already bought t-shirts and stickers and mugs, but I haven't really pushed it much because I knew it could be so much better, especially if I let a damn professional design something for me rather than my amateur ass struggling to make something on Canva. So yeah, definitely look for new merch soon, and I will let you know as soon as it becomes available. If you want to be among the first to find out, make sure you sign up for the 100% free Wild West newsletter. Link down below, or head on over to wildwestjosh.substack.com and sign up. Okay, and the second announcement. I've gotten a lot of questions lately as to why I haven't been rolling my R's during the show's intro. And, well, I got a confession to make. I wasn't really rolling my R's, at least not correctly. To be honest, I was just sort of faking it. And that god-awful noise I was making was more of a gurgling sound with the back of my throat than actually rolling my R's. After spending way too long watching YouTube tutorials on how to properly roll R's, I decided to take the L and call it quits. So my apologies. I know a lot of you liked it, I did too, but it just seems kind of silly to keep doing it when I know that I'm not doing it the right way. Long story short, I gotta get my ass to a speech therapist one of these days. Okay, one last thing and then we'll wrap it up. I was recently tipped off by a listener that Wild West Extravaganza content is being ripped off on YouTube. Somebody was just basically taking my exact words, running the script through one of those shitty AI programs, and reposting it. And it wasn't even one of the good ones either. They're using the damn robot voice. I mean, come on. Do you want to hear a robot tell you about the history of the Old West, or an idiot like myself? So if you hear anything like this, just know that it's not me making this content. Unless it's in my voice, it's not me, okay? And as long as I've still got my voice, I'll be using it to tell these stories and not some damn robot. And if you do see somebody ripping off our content, just report them or let me know about it and I'll report their trifling asses my own damn self. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all the comments, emails, and suggestions. And please, until next time, don't go putting your cigars out in other people's eyeballs, okay? Don't try to rig a professional boxing match, and whatever you do, don't go spouting off about the Queen on Independence Day. Till next time, adios.